Okay, good afternoon to you. My stance on this subject is very much on the behavioural and ethical side. In the last few months I've put together and run 3 major events on bribery and corruption. And I must say to you, at every event I learn, not only just from the speakers, but also from the participants. And what I'm going to share with you is some of the feedback. I'm also going to give it a sort of like an audit and risk slant as well. My main message today and this afternoon is if we're doing things properly anyway, why should we worry about the act? I'm not selling a range of services, but what I am trying to sell to you is how to do things properly. And I think a lot of the feedback I've heard and a lot of the questions that people have asked at the events I've run is why should we change what we're doing? And arguably, we probably shouldn't. If we're doing things properly and we've got all these procedures and processes in place, what's changed? And that's my main message, but I want to share with you some of the things that particularly concern me. I've broken down my slot into 3 main areas. First of all, a bit of the impact of the Bribery Act, which will cross-reference a bit Neil's and Ben's. I want to talk about key risk areas, but also I want to talk about what are the sorts of things we should be doing now. You are sitting very quietly at the minute. The way this is going to work is a bit of participation as well, which is probably a bit sad for whatever it is afternoon. But I'm going to ask you a few things as well, and hopefully get a bit of feedback from you also. Okay. I've got a little quote for you there. Ethics is fundamental to our reputation. What sort of organisation do you think quoted that in their latest set of accounts? Anyone guess? The company's been mentioned before, so it's a bit of a test really. BAE. Who's listening to Ben? BAE. Okay. This is the head of corporate responsibility for BAE. I would refer you also to the latest copies of the BAE reports. They're really great to look at on how an organisation approaches ethics and culture, behaviours, etc. Ben referred to the Wolf Committee report, which followed on with the BAE initial scandals. But if you look at the latest report and last year's report and accounts, it's really interesting to see how BAE are addressing some of the issues that Lord Wolf and his committee raised. So it's really a model. Even if you're not in the defence industry, a lot of the things you could really apply to your organisation from a risk management point of view, from an executive point of view, from an internal audit point of view. So I really refer you to that. They're really good examples. 2 quotes from the Fraud Advisory Panel. This goes back about 4 years now. Maybe if you read this yourself and then we'll talk about it. The key thing is ethical culture. And what does it really mean? One of the organisations I work with is the Institute of Internal Auditors, and for the last year or so I've been presenting district events on ethics and culture, which really sadly have been really poorly attended events. I truly believe ethics and culture underpins everything we do. Whatever sector you happen to be in, if the way we do things isn't appropriate, the whole risk management structure collapses. People have come to this event, found it very useful, but it's really, really interesting to see what organisations are trying to do. Virtually 100% of the people who've come, all different sectors, say our organisation says from the top level, of course we're an ethical organisation. They tell the outside world we only do things properly, we employ people properly, the way we deal with people is great. That doesn't seem to drop down. And when we start debating the subject, and we look at practicalities, from an internal audit perspective, it's an area that internal audit don't look at, basically, because it's too airy-fairy, it's behavioural, how can you review it, etc. And yet I believe, if we get that right, the rest of it fits into place. But this quote I said was 4 years ago, but it's as reasonable then as it is today. The next quote, again from the Fraud Advisory Panel, is back to a behaviour thing. It's how we behave. People actually watch the way your senior management, your executives behave. And if you look back at some of the cases in the States, people like Enron, etc., Enron had one of the best ethical policies in the world. And years before this happened, I used their ethical policy as a quote of how to do things properly. So they had this policy, did anyone actually comply with it? People actually watch behaviours. From a totally fraud management point of view, if your boss comes in late, leaves early, has a boozy lunch, it's okay for me to steal. People watch behaviours. The way that people walk around the building, the way they approach you, the way they deal with complaints, etc. And staff and employees fit in with the culture of the organisation. The vast majority of people won't say, actually the culture around here isn't that great, I'm going to move down the road. They'll say, well if it works, we'll bend the rules a bit. And when people join a company for the first time, they explain the way we do business, and and you've got a great salary, possibly a pension, if you're very lucky, a car possibly, who wants to leave this company? And so you change the way of thinking, which is quite bizarre really, despite the fact you think maybe what the organisation is doing isn't that great. You say, well, okay, if it works around here, I'll twist with it. And then the culture, you're moulded in with the culture of the organisation. And that, I think, is a huge, huge issue. But how to bottom this out is very, very difficult. Okay, we've talked about some of the impacts. The key thing, I think, we start from the top. And the key word there is ownership. To what extent does your board and senior management executive actually own the problem of bribery? That isn't paying lip service to it and saying, this is something we've got to do, but to what extent do we own a problem? Again, feedback to you, which links to what Ben was saying. Often on a board of directors, I've had feedback, there's one person who might be the champion. It might be the legal guy, it might be the compliance guy, it might be the risk guy, and he or she is trying to convince the board that this is an important subject. That doesn't really fit in with sort of joint and several responsibility. This is a subject that impacts on the whole organisation, which I'll share with you later on. It's not just a little project that we need to address, this is a cultural issue that spans the whole organisation. We've talked about tone at the top. I don't know if anyone's read the recent PwC report, which came out, I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago. And they did a worldwide survey on tone at the top. Well, not particularly bribery and corruption, but tone at the top generally. And I'm going to share with you some of the stats there, but again, it's a really interesting report to read. The good news, I'll share with you the good news to start off with, is 87% of the respondents, this is a worldwide survey, agreed or strongly agreed that culture contributes to the mitigation of risk around fraud, corruption and ethical behaviour. So that's the good news actually. So 87% of organisations felt it was really important. However, then it becomes a little bit less good actually. Less than half of respondents say that senior leadership always act as role models in setting a tone from the top. So that's quite interesting. Less than 50% feel their leaders are actually doing the right thing. It's not just saying the right thing, but doing the right thing as well. One of the survey participants said, the ultimate driver is the need for leaders themselves to be ethical towards employees, customers, suppliers, etc., not just do it because it sounds like a good idea or regulations require it. So in other words, it's walking the talk. And we all should be doing that all the time. So we've got teams of people working with us. We demonstrate best practice. People follow what we do, all right? Rather than just the rules and procedures. Gets a little bit worse. 70% agree or strongly agree that ethical risks are identified, but only 34% report they're adequately measured or evaluated. So everyone thinks it's a great idea. So what does ethics mean for our organisation? But only a third of organisations they surveyed are actually measuring what it means. And so if you aren't measuring what it means, how do we know we're even trying to tackle the subject? And only 27% of organisations actually said they terminated business when there was unethical practice. And that's probably the bottom line. So in other words, 75% of organisations, or just under, probably wouldn't. And I think this is the root cause, and I know Ben talked about tone at the top, but it's the real issue, isn't it really? It's how we behave as an organisation, which is then cascaded down. We've touched on ethics and culture. How do we measure that? How do we control that? The key issue is risk management for the organisation, which I'll talk a bit about later on, and I also want to talk about policy development and communication. We've talked about adequacy of current procedures. What does that actually mean? Very disturbingly, sometimes when I present to groups of auditors, both internal and external auditors, they actually struggle with trying to identify what a control is. And I ran an event in Manchester about 6 months ago, and as part of the session I was running, I asked people in their groups to define what a control was. About 70 or 80% of the people were auditors. There were some risk managers and some external auditors. First of all, they struggled to identify what a control was. And second of all, their definitions all were a bit different, even in the same sector. So from an executive's point of view, you can have a procedure in place, but ultimately, it's what's controlling that procedure. Who's reviewing that process? Where's the management check? Where's the balance, etc.? And you're starting to get into a lot of micro detail. But all I'd share with you, if internal auditors and risk managers struggle with what a control is, how are we going to reassure people our processes and controls and procedures are adequate, unless we've got a clear idea what a control is? And so we often tick in the box. And again, we were talking a bit at that session about procurement. which is obviously a subject which is close to many people's hearts. And what I'd shared with the people, what's your main control that your procurement or purchasing function is operating effectively? And what they said to me is, well, we have a purchasing policy. And is that enough? And disturbingly, very few people said, well, I think it is. Most people said, yeah, that was enough. The fact we've got a policy, it must be okay. What I tried to stress with them, it's not just the policy, it's the procedure behind that. Who managed that procedure? Where was the control? And more importantly, who was ensuring that the control was operating? And that's often the weak bit. Boards of directors issue a policy document, which Ben was talking about, which goes on the intranet. The feedback I get from some of these people is if I put something on the intranet, that means, first of all, it's been properly communicated. Second of all, people actually understand what was in that particular document. Third of all, they've actually got procedures and controls to ensure it happens. And fourth of all, they're actually complying with it. Boards cannot get the point that there's a huge gap between putting something on the intranet and ensuring compliance. All right? And I think this Act particularly starts to focus for the first time executives' views on what does all this mean at the lower level, because that's where you want the reassurance. And it might be internal audit providing, external audit, consultancy, line management, etc. But we have to start drilling down probably for the first time. And that's where I think the key issues are. If we're trying to control a process, what does that mean in your particular organisation? If something isn't working properly, where's the feedback loop? All right? So it's great when we're talking about adequate procedures and whatever comes out in February, March next year and finally is implemented in April, you're building your procedures. Where's the feedback if something isn't working? Do your organisations currently have a process for identifying all the way back up the line where there's been a deviation, where people haven't been complying with laid down procedures? Most organisations, I suggest to you, don't have that. They might do for major items, but the general view is, my God, we won't tell people up the line until we're sure we've sorted out the problem. Most organisations don't want to know, actually, there's a problem. This Act now requires you to make sure you've got that feedback loop. If something happens, you've got a chain of command all the way up to the top to say we've got a bit of an exposure. What the Act doesn't define is the extent of exposure. But most organisations don't have it. Things may be filtered up the line, but as they get higher and higher, less and less gets to the top. This requires this Act requires your most senior people to appreciate where there's deviations anywhere in the world. So it's a complete change in the way of thinking. Sort of convincing you? Nods, shakes? No, not worried yet. Okay. Training and awareness, and all three of us, I think, are covering the same issue. There's a big training need with the Bribery Act and implementation. But it's training and understanding need. From the point of view of the Act, just training people isn't good enough. You've got to make sure people understand what they're supposed to be doing. So it's a huge investment of time and effort, particularly, I think, on this procedural side. Incident reporting. To what extent, if let's say you've got overseas operations or operations around the UK, to what extent is an incident that happens locally reported centrally? Do you have a financial figure? Do you have a nature of the incident? And maybe get some sort of feedback, and you'll work for different organisations in different parts of the organisation. Something happens in one part of the organisation, what's the feedback? How do executives know? Would someone like to share with me how that works? It could be a fraud, it could be a loss, it could be doing something they're not supposed to be doing. How does that work in your organisation? Now people are feverishly writing, I know, and they look away from me. So how does it work in your organisation anyway? So
we have a risk panel
that
monitors all these sort of things, whether it's a complaint or a claim.
Brilliant. So you have a risk panel where people report into that risk panel the issues. And that risk panel operates across the organisation and can see at a glance the sort of issue. All right? You need some sort of central reporting. It could be a panel, it could be a committee, it could be someone on the board. But someone you need to report these things to. Again, for the sake of this Act, it's really important you've got that sort of control in place. Okay. Key risk areas, I think. There's been a huge amount of information recently about risk management policies and risk appetite. What does risk appetite mean? It's the appetite the organisation is prepared to take with a particular subject. But what's the big problem with risk appetite? Is that a term you're familiar with? Because sort of nods or shakes, okay? Risk appetite varies in different parts of the organisation. And in the recent report on corporate governance, which came out about 6 months ago, there's a big issue with organisations understanding what it means, right? Is it risk tolerance? Is it the appetite for taking risk? And in many organisations, the risk appetite varies across different parts of the organisation. And if people don't particularly understand what that means, and this is the main measure of the risk which is acceptable to take, many organisations are struggling. So risk appetite is really important as a subject we need to focus on. Do all your organisations have a risk database or risk register? Are you aware of them? Sort of hands up if they do. Okay. Keep your hands up if Bribery Act and bribery is on that risk register. Okay, about 7 or 8 hands have gone down. You must make sure that if you've got a risk register, this subject of bribery and corruption is now on your risk database. Because if it's not on your risk database and risk register, it's not even been thought about at the executive level. And then you need to populate it. But about half the hands went down. So that's a key area to address. Talk about risk ownership again. The board needs to own the subject. A good way of doing it is through the risk database, risk register. Bribery risk is appreciated. What does it mean to an individual? People would say, and they've said to me in a lot of the sessions I've run, of course bribery doesn't impact on our organisation. You start talking about what the organisation does, the way it operates, bribery is a major part, but people think it's someone else's problem. There's some sort of financial limit. There's only above £1,000 we need to worry, and after all, everyone else does it. And I've heard that many times. Well, but you understand, Martin, but everyone else in their sector does this. Okay, but that still doesn't make it right, does it? One of the presentations on Bribery Act I put together was in Northern Ireland about a month ago, and we had someone from the police service in Northern Ireland talking, and he was the nominated expert on the Bribery Act within the Northern Ireland Constabulary. And he recently picked up the Bribery Act, and he said he'd been through all the legislation, and he said the bottom line from his point of view, which is really interesting, is I know what's right and what's wrong. And that's the issue. You can go through all the different clauses, which I know we're going to talk about later on, of the Bribery Act and what it means, and he said when you stand back from something, if you're in a court of law, would you say that procedure, that operation, what you're doing was right or wrong? And that's the issue. Is it right or is it wrong? And trying to find a grey area where you can wheedle through the legislation actually isn't acceptable. And he put it actually very clearly, I think. We've already touched on knowing your suppliers, knowing your business partners and customers. We also touched on a bit of due diligence. It's so important, especially if you're dealing with people around the world who you're not had direct control of. Independent contractors, people, consultants working for contractors, etc. No way I'm in control of those. Okay, some of the areas I think we should be worried about from an operational point of view, obviously the whole area of procurement is a particularly difficult area. How we manage procurement, how we source things, how we set up our contracts, how we do tenders, etc. Outsource management, so topical at the minute, many organisations are outsourcing. And they think they outsource because they're getting rid of the risks. You're increasing the risks because you aren't controlling the process anymore. A great area to focus on, because this is someone's sort of responsible, but ultimately we're responsible in our organisation. Joint ventures, big area as well. If you've got joint ventures with other organisations, have they got the standards that you'd expect to see? Because especially if they're a smaller organisation to you, you could be pulled down by one of your partners. The whole area of financial control, the way the business is controlled financially, could give you a very early warning sign things aren't quite right. Payments processing as well, some of the things they're going through. Are we focusing on bribery risk when people are reviewing systems, reviewing payments for authorisation, etc.? HR and payroll, when we actually recruit someone, do we actually ask them, we look at from a point of ethical point of view, fraud point of view, would we trust these sort of people? Payroll, who are the people we're paying through payroll, the types of organisations we're paying, etc., etc., legal and compliance. These are just a few of the areas I'd be concerned about. And yet most organisations are focusing on the procurement. The Bribery Act is all to do with purchasing. No, it's not. It's to do with all these as well. So to what extent are these sorts of functions in your organisation aware of some of the issues? And beneath these things, I think, should be a real checklist of the sort of things we should be worried about. Okay, some of the ways forward, I think. It's back to the ownership and buy-in, I think, from the executive to senior management. What we should be doing at this stage, before it comes to February time, is identifying and evaluating the key risks. Not just having a list, but where are the risks we face in our organisation? What are the things that we're most open to? This involves dialogue across the organisation, involving different functions, and not just one champion. Clearly training and awareness is very important. And we need to review the policies we've got worldwide. Not do we have a policy which is entitled procurement policy, but what's actually in it. Where are the checks and balances, where are the controls, where's the incident reporting, where's the feedback loop. And I think that's the most important bit that organisations aren't looking at the minute. First thing as well, openness, okay? Shouldn't be a closed debate. This shouldn't be regarded as a regulatory compliance exercise. This is a behavioural exercise. This gets to the root cause, the root operation of our organisation. How we behave, how we do business, how we communicate with our suppliers, customers, etc. So actually having a dialogue with your executives, your staff, etc. is very important. What people need to know is, what does this mean for me? All right? How is it important for my function, my section? And we need to translate that into business reality. What I'd say to you, which I really started off with, is any organisation with sound governance, risk management, ethical approaches, really shouldn't be worried. So if we're doing things properly anyway, and we have a good ethical approach in what we do, and we have sound procedures, sound governance, good risk management, we shouldn't be worried at all. However, many organisations don't. But I'd argue we should already be doing the right thing. And that's what I lead you on. Is it right or is it wrong? Yes, have a look at the Act, but is the way we approach things the correct way of doing business or not? Okay. Thank you very much.